September 1940, Bell Telephone Laboratories, New Jersey. The British physicist Edward Bowen opened a metal deed box and lifted out an object roughly the size of a hockey puck. Copper, precisely machined, with a weight that surprised the American scientists crowding around the laboratory bench. Bowen connected it to a power supply. The device hummed to life. On an oscilloscope screen across the room, a signal appeared that made the American naval officers present lean forward in their chairs. 400 watts of microwave power at a wavelength of 10 centimeters. More power than the Americans had managed to generate at any wavelength, at a frequency they hadn't thought possible to harness, from a device that fit in a human hand. One of the American scientists present would later write that the moment felt like suddenly being handed the key to a locked door we'd been trying to break down for years. The British called it a cavity magnetron. The Americans called it a revolution. But to understand why this small copper device provoked such a response, you have to understand what brought the British to America that autumn, what they were willing to give away, and what the Americans thought they knew about the limits of physics itself. August 1940. Britain had been at war for nearly a year. France had fallen in June. The British Expeditionary Force had evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind nearly all its heavy equipment. The Luftwaffe was beginning the sustained bombing campaign that would become the Blitz. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, and Winston Churchill's government faced a calculation that kept them awake at night. They were going to lose. Not immediately, not next month, but the mathematics were brutal. Britain's industrial capacity couldn't match Germany's. The Royal Navy could control the seas, but couldn't invade the continent. The Royal Air Force was holding its own in the skies over England, but barely, and at a cost in pilots and aircraft that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Britain needed an ally with industrial capacity that dwarfed Germany's. They needed America, but America was neutral. The isolationist movement was strong. Roosevelt wanted to help Britain, but Congress and public opinion limited what he could do. Selling weapons to Britain was legal under cash and carry provisions, but direct military aid was politically impossible. America wasn't going to enter the war to save Britain, unless Britain could offer something America desperately wanted. This is where the story becomes strange, because what Britain decided to offer was the one thing nations at war normally guard most jealously: their military secrets. Not some secrets. Not carefully selected, sanitized intelligence. Everything. The complete technical specifications of their most advanced military technologies, including devices so secret that most of the British government didn't know they existed. The decision was made at the highest levels. Churchill approved it. The Chiefs of Staff approved it. Sir Henry Tizard, rector of Imperial College London and one of Britain's leading scientists, would lead the mission. His team would include John Cockcroft, a nuclear physicist who would later win the Nobel Prize, and Edward Bowen, a radar expert who had worked on Britain's early warning systems. They would bring blueprints, they would bring prototypes, they would bring the accumulated knowledge of Britain's scientific war effort, developed at enormous cost over years of research. And they would hand it to a neutral nation with no guarantee that America would ever enter the war, and no way to prevent America from simply taking the technology and leaving Britain to its fate. The risk was existential. If Germany learned what Britain was sharing, they would know exactly what British radar could and couldn't detect, what frequencies to jam, what tactics to use. If America took the technology but stayed neutral, Britain would have armed a potential future rival for nothing. If the mission failed to convince America of the technology's value, Britain would have revealed its desperation for no gain. But if it worked, if the Americans could be convinced to throw their industrial might behind developing these technologies, the resulting weapons might change the course of the war. And Britain would have bound America to their cause through shared technology and shared investment in a way that political speeches never could. The mission sailed for America in late August 1940. They carried their secrets in a metal deed box, the kind lawyers used for important documents. Inside, blueprints for the Whittle jet engine, designs for the proximity fuse, a device that would revolutionize anti-aircraft fire, specifications for advanced explosives, technical details of British submarine detection systems, plans for rocket weapons, and, wrapped carefully in protective material, the cavity magnetron. When they arrived in Washington, the American military and scientific leadership wasn't sure what to make of them. Vannevar Bush, who chaired the National Defense Research Committee, had been expecting British visitors, but the scope of what they were offering surprised him. Carl Compton, president of MIT, was skeptical that the British had anything America didn't already possess. The American military had its own radar development programs. The Navy's CXM radar was already operational on warships. Why would Britain give away secrets to a neutral nation unless those secrets weren't actually valuable? The British asked for a demonstration. They wanted to show, not tell. Bowen unpacked the magnetron at Bell Labs, where American scientists had been working on their own microwave research. The Americans gathered around. Bowen explained what they were looking at, though the explanation probably seemed impossible. The device generated microwaves through resonant cavities, achieving power outputs that conventional vacuum tubes couldn't approach. It operated at centimeter wavelengths, far shorter than anything the Americans had managed to use for radar. Then he turned it on. The American scientists present had been working with radar at meter wavelengths, roughly 100 times longer than what the magnetron produced. They knew the theory that suggested shorter wavelengths would give better resolution, allow smaller antennas, and enable more precise detection. But they also knew the practical problems. Generating significant power at centimeter wavelengths had seemed years away. The vacuum tubes they'd been using simply couldn't do it. They'd tried. Multiple research groups had tried. The physics appeared to set hard limits on what was possible. The magnetron ignored those limits. The oscilloscope trace showed clean, powerful microwave generation at 10 centimeters. 400 watts of continuous power. Later production versions would reach kilowatts. From a device, small enough to hold in one hand, that could be mass-produced, that solved in one elegant design a dozen problems the Americans had been attacking separately. Alfred Loomis, a wealthy physicist who had funded his own radar research laboratory, examined the device and immediately grasped the implications. A radar set using this magnetron could be small enough to fit in an aircraft. It could detect a submarine's periscope from the air. It could guide bombs to targets at night. It could see through clouds and darkness with resolution measured in feet, not hundreds of yards. The British had built a few prototype sets and proven all of this already. They'd brought photographs. They'd brought test data. They'd brought the solution to problems the Americans didn't know could be solved. The institutional response came swiftly. Within weeks, MIT was organizing what would become the Radiation Laboratory, a massive research center dedicated to developing microwave radar. The Navy immediately began planning production. The Army wanted systems for anti-aircraft fire control. The scientific community mobilized. Funding flowed. Contracts were written. By October, barely a month after the demonstration, the RAD Lab was operational with some of America's best physicists abandoning their own research to work on radar development. But the Admirals' response went beyond institutional enthusiasm. The Navy's leadership had spent years thinking about how to fight the next war. They'd invested heavily in battleships, in aircraft carriers, in submarines. They'd developed tactics and doctrine. They'd trained officers and crews, and they'd worried constantly about the problem of finding the enemy at sea, of detecting aircraft at night, of hitting targets they couldn't see. Radar was supposed to help with that. The Navy's CXAM set, installed on warships starting in 1940, could detect aircraft at distances of 50 miles or more. It was a significant advantage. But it had limitations. The antenna was enormous, a complex array that weighed tons and required a dedicated structure. The resolution was measured in degrees, meaning contacts appeared as fuzzy blobs on the display. Multiple aircraft flying in formation looked like a single target. Ships close together merged into one return. The system couldn't see surface targets well at all, and it couldn't fit on anything smaller than a cruiser. The magnetron changed everything. A radar set built around it could fit on a destroyer, on a patrol boat, even on an aircraft. It could see individual ships in a convoy. It could detect a submarine on the surface at night. It could guide fighters to intercept bombers with precision. It could aim guns at targets invisible to the human eye. The tactical implications cascaded through every aspect of naval warfare. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, oversaw the Navy's immediate response. The historical record doesn't preserve his exact words upon seeing the magnetron demonstrated, but his actions spoke clearly. Within months, the Navy had contracts for multiple radar development programs, all based on the British technology. The budget for radar research increased by orders of magnitude. Officers were assigned to learn the new systems. Doctrine began changing to incorporate capabilities that hadn't existed before. Rear Admiral Julius Führer, who coordinated the Navy's research and development efforts, worked directly with the British mission and the American scientists. The Navy had been cautious about radar, treating it as a useful but limited tool. After the magnetron demonstration, radar became central to naval planning. Every major warship would carry it. Every aircraft that could accommodate the equipment would get it. The Navy's entire approach to night operations, to anti-submarine warfare, to fleet defense against air attack, shifted to assume radar capabilities that the magnetron made possible. The scientists who worked with the Navy during this period recorded their impressions. Ernest Lawrence, the physicist who invented the cyclotron, joined the radar development effort and later wrote about the Navy's transformation from skeptical customers to enthusiastic partners. The Admirals had seen enough new weapons to be wary of promises. They'd watched inventors demonstrate devices that worked in laboratories but failed in combat. They'd learned to discount claims of revolutionary technology. But the magnetron wasn't a promise. It was a working device. The British had operational systems. They'd used them in combat. They had results, and the results were extraordinary. British radar had been crucial in the Battle of Britain, allowing RAF fighters to intercept German bombers efficiently despite being outnumbered. British coastal radar stations could track aircraft across the Channel, providing early warning that made the difference between successful interception and bombers reaching their targets unopposed. British ships equipped with radar could fight at night, could detect submarines, could coordinate fleet movements in darkness and fog. The technology worked. The British were proving it worked every day in combat. What astonished the American naval leadership wasn't just that the technology worked, but that the British were giving it away, freely, completely, with no restrictions. The magnetron wasn't the only revelation. The proximity fuse, which used a tiny radar set to detonate shells near aircraft without requiring a direct hit, would revolutionize anti-aircraft warfare. The British shared the complete design. The jet engine, which would transform military aviation, came with full specifications and test data. Advanced explosives, submarine detection systems, communications equipment, all the accumulated military research of a nation that had been at war for a year, handed over with instructions and offers to help with production. Nations didn't do this. Military secrets were guarded obsessively. Allies shared some intelligence, some tactical information, but not the crown jewels of their weapons development, not the devices that gave them crucial advantages, not the technology that their survival might depend on. The act of sharing revealed how desperate Britain's situation was, but also how confident they were in the technology's value. They were betting everything that America would recognize what they were being offered and respond appropriately. The American response justified the bet. By early 1941, the radiation laboratory at MIT employed hundreds of scientists and engineers. Contracts worth millions of dollars funded radar development. Multiple companies were working on production. The Navy was installing improved radar sets on ships. The Army was deploying anti-aircraft systems that used radar for targeting. American and British scientists were collaborating openly, sharing results, building on each other's work. The technology transfer went both ways. American industrial techniques improved British designs. American research solved problems the British had struggled with. The partnership accelerated development beyond what either nation could have achieved alone. And the partnership bound America to Britain in ways that political agreements couldn't match. Thousands of American scientists and engineers were now working on technologies that only mattered if Britain survived. Millions of dollars of American investment depended on the war continuing in a way that allowed the technology to be used. American factories were tooling up to produce equipment designed to British specifications. The industrial and scientific communities of both nations were increasingly intertwined. When Pearl Harbor brought America into the war in December 1941, the radar partnership was already 15 months old. American ships carried radar systems that wouldn't have existed without the magnetron. American aircraft were being equipped with radar that could detect submarines. American factories were producing thousands of radar sets per month. The technology that Britain had shared in desperation had become a foundation of American military capability. The admirals who'd watched that first magnetron demonstration in September 1940 had understood immediately what they were seeing. Not just a better radar component, not just an incremental improvement, a fundamental leap in capability that would reshape naval warfare. The ability to see in darkness and through weather. The ability to detect and target enemies beyond visual range. The ability to coordinate forces across vast distances with precision. The ability to defend against air attack effectively. All from a device small enough to hold in your hand. The magnetron's impact on the Pacific War would be profound. American destroyers hunting Japanese submarines used magnetron-based radar to detect targets on the surface at night, when submarines had to run their diesel engines to recharge batteries. American aircraft used airborne magnetron radar to find Japanese ships in darkness and bad weather. American anti-aircraft systems used magnetron-based fire control radar to shoot down Japanese aircraft with unprecedented accuracy. The technology that Britain shared in 1940 became a crucial American advantage in 1942, 43, 44, and 45. But in September 1940, none of that was certain. Britain was gambling that America would value the technology enough to help. America was deciding whether to trust a desperate ally offering what seemed too good to be true. The admirals looking at that small copper device had to imagine how it would change their navy, their tactics, their ability to fight and win at sea. They had to convince Congress to fund development. They had to persuade their own officers that this new technology was worth the disruption of installing it on every ship. They had to believe that the physics was real, that the British results could be replicated, that the investment would pay off. The decision to embrace the magnetron and the broader technology transfer wasn't just technical. It was strategic. It committed America to a vision of the war where technology would be decisive, where industrial capacity mattered more than existing military strength, where scientific innovation could shift the balance of power. It committed America to partnership with Britain in a way that made neutrality increasingly untenable. It committed American industry and science to producing weapons for a war America wasn't yet fighting. The British understood this. Tizard and his team hadn't just brought technology. They'd brought a strategic vision where Britain and America, working together, could outproduce and out-innovate the Axis powers. Where American factories would build weapons to British designs. Where British combat experience would guide American development. Where the scientific and industrial resources of both nations would be pooled against a common enemy. The magnetron was the proof that this vision could work. The technology was real. The collaboration was possible. The results would be decisive. When Bowen packed up the magnetron after that first demonstration, the Americans asked if they could keep it. They wanted to study it, to understand it, to begin their own development immediately. The British agreed. They'd brought several. They'd brought blueprints. They'd brought manufacturing specifications. They'd brought everything needed to start production. Take it, they said. Build more. Build better. Win the war. The Admirals went back to their offices and started making plans. New radar systems for every ship class. Training programs for radar operators. Tactical doctrine for radar-directed combat. Procurement contracts. Research programs. The institutional machinery of the Navy began, turning, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the implications became clear. The Navy that would fight at Midway, at Guadalcanal, at Leyte Gulf, at Okinawa, would be a Navy transformed by technology that didn't exist in American hands before September 1940. The scientists went back to their laboratories and started calculating. Power requirements, antenna designs, signal processing, manufacturing tolerances. The radiation laboratory at MIT would eventually employ nearly 4,000 people. It would develop more than 100 different radar systems. It would spend more than $100 million. It would train thousands of radar operators and maintenance technicians. It would publish classified research that filled libraries. All of it traced back to that small copper device the British brought across the Atlantic in a deed box. The story of what American admirals said when Britain shared their radar technology isn't really about words. The historical record doesn't preserve dramatic quotes, doesn't give us the moment of revelation in dialogue. What it gives us is actions, decisions, resources committed, programs launched, priorities shifted, an entire military service reorienting itself around capabilities that hadn't existed months before. That was the response. That was what the admirals said, in the language of institutional commitment and strategic choice. They said yes. They said this matters. They said we'll build our Navy around this. They said we'll invest whatever it takes. They said we'll change how we fight. They said thank you. And then they said, let's build 1,000 of them, 10,000, whatever we need. They said the British were right to bet on us, and we're going to prove it. The magnetron itself was elegant physics embodied in copper and ceramic. The resonant cavities generated microwaves through principles that were understood but had seemed impossible to harness practically. The British had solved the engineering problems, had turned theory into working hardware, had proven it in combat. They'd created a device that would be called one of the most important inventions of the war, that would save thousands of lives, that would help win battles across every theater of the war. And they'd given it away to a neutral nation with no guarantee of return, because the alternative was losing the war, and Britain's leadership had decided that sharing their secrets with America was a better bet than holding them close and fighting alone. It was a calculation born of desperation, but executed with precision. The Tizard mission brought the right technology, at the right time, to the right people, with the right presentation to make the value undeniable. The American admirals, scientists, and political leaders who received that technology faced their own calculation. They could take it and remain neutral. They could develop it slowly, cautiously, keeping their options open. They could doubt its value, question the British motives, hesitate, or they could recognize what they were being offered and respond with the full weight of American industrial and scientific capability. They chose the latter. Within weeks, the machinery was in motion. Within months, American radar development had leaped ahead by years. Within a year, American factories were producing radar sets in quantities the British couldn't match. The partnership worked. The technology transfer succeeded beyond what either side had hoped. And when America entered the war, it did so with capabilities that wouldn't have existed without that metal deed box carried across the Atlantic in August 1940. The cavity magnetron, that small copper device that fit in a hand, had changed everything. Not through any single dramatic moment, not through any memorable quote, but through the systematic transformation of how modern militaries could see, target, and fight. The admirals who first saw it understood that immediately. Their response, measured in budgets and programs and institutional commitment, said everything that needed to be said. They'd seen the future of naval warfare, and they'd decided to build it.